or seek shelter, one man collapsed and died as he prepared his home in the face of that blaze. And bushfire looks certain to be a big news item through the remainder of this week. 40-degree temperatures headed for much of southern Australia across the balance of the week. Today marks the 75th anniversary of one of the worst bushfire disasters in Australia, indeed the world, the Black Friday fires of 1939. The figures are quite extraordinary. The fires burned about 3/4 of Victoria. They killed 71 people, destroyed 1,300 homes, 69 sawmills, several towns wiped completely off the map. There was a Royal Commission. In the wake of those fires, it found that one of the key problems was high fuel load. It was from that point that the current regime of prescribed burning was established. Now, with Victoria facing its first stretch of intensely hot summer weather this week for this season, let's have a look back using this anniversary at Black Friday. What, if any, lessons have been learned? How have things changed? David Packham is a fire management consultant. He worked at the CSIRO for 18 years. He's extensively researched those Black Friday fires. David, welcome.
Good morning.
It's a long time ago, and in some ways those Black Friday fires of 39, similar to the Black Saturday fires of 2009, were there similarities in circumstance?
Oh, of course there were, because what you have to have a bushfire disaster, and in Victoria, which is probably the worst place in the world for fire threat, in Victoria, you probably have a bushfire disaster situation about once every, well, the statistics work out 26 and a half years. Let's call it 30 years. So about, on the average, going right back to the 1890s, if things continue on as they do, as they are, then we can expect a Black Saturday type disaster on the average about once every 30 years, which doesn't mean to say that you can't have two in 5 years.
Of course. And what is it about Victoria that makes it such a bad place for very bad fire?
Well, to have very bad fires, you need several things to line up together. You need the weather, you need the fuel, and you need the ignitions. Now, Victoria has got all of those. We have extraordinarily bad fire weather in Victoria because we have these hot desert winds, and there's been some recent research only published last week that gives us an insight into more of those and where they come from and how they come. And so you need these very hot, windy outbursts. One of the interesting things about the next week we've got here is that we've got the high temperatures, but we haven't got the wind. So our fire danger is really much more modest than what we imagine for the next few days, if the forecasters are right, and they've been right much more often than they're wrong. You also need fuels. Without fuel, you get no fire. That's obvious. And we do have a highly flammable fuel that builds up in our eucalyptus forests and our grasslands. In eucalyptus forests, it builds up to reach a maximum and an equilibrium after about 30 years since it's been burnt. And maybe that's where our 30-year cycles sort of might come from.
Yes.
You also need the ignitions. Now, if people don't ignite fires by accident or very rarely and occasionally and disastrously on purpose, then God comes along and gives us a whole bunch of lightning strikes. So we have to learn how to prosecute God, don't we?
So the fires will occur, but
yes.
that Royal Commission after the 39 fires, the Stretton inquiry, that made some landmark recommendations around bushfire mitigation.
Yes,
What were some of those?
Yes, it did indeed. And I suppose the most important one that was there, but is not now emphasised terribly much, is that there had been far too little prescribed burning done in Victoria leading up to those 1939 fires. See, it's pretty much beyond reasonable doubt that the Indigenous people had this country absolutely safe from fires and looking beautiful. That's why Australia was called Australia Felix. And they did that because they burnt it. And the Australian bush, the love has evolved around fire. Now, we have come along in the last 100 years or so, and we've reckoned we can change that. Well, we can't, because the penalty for not doing what the Indigenous people did is what we're going through with disaster fires.
It's a complex thing, isn't it? Because often with the best intentions, people say, well, no, we should preserve and conserve the bush, and yet, as you say, there's a lot of work being done about Indigenous management and the use of fire in that work, and the parkland that was much of Australia's forest country, for many tens of thousands of years.
Yes,
So that
this wonderful work that Professor Bill Gammage has done with his book on the biggest estate on earth, which won the Prime Minister's Prize. It was so good. Is the reoccurring phrase throughout there that when Australia was first colonised from Europe, that it was so much like an English gentleman's estate. Now we're overstocked. There's fuel, you can't get through it. It is deadly, it is dangerous, and of course the weird thing is, and life is full of weird things, that the way to preserve and look after our native animals and our natural bush is to burn it, but frequently and with low intensity fires. So we've changed the regime into infrequent and high intensity fires, and we're going to have to wait another 10,000 years for that to evolve into something that is much more stable than what it is now. So I think that we should, as reasonably quickly as possible, try and catch up with how the Indigenous people had what they had achieved in this land.
And what's the situation as you see it now, David Packham? Do we have, yes, there is a lot of growth and perhaps a fair bit of fuel. Is that fuel load at a risky level?
The fuel levels are the most dangerous that we have had in Australia for probably the last 30 to 50,000 years at this moment. And unless we do something about it, we are going to continue to have our Black Saturdays.
It must get to the point where it's difficult to mitigate that load without some sort of extreme event, because it is built up to such an extent.
No, we are very fortunate, as much as in West Australia there has been 30 or 40 years of very extensive understanding, work and practice of how you can do your prescribed burning at times of the year and under weather conditions that do come pretty close to how the Indigenous people used to burn. Not totally, but the West Australians have got to the stage where they were allowed to, and now they're not allowed to, in the Perth Hills, for example, and that's the problem, where they could even undertake safely prescribed burning during January. Could you just imagine that? And that is the extent of the knowledge that does exist. What we don't have is the political will to actually achieve that.
Yes, it's an extraordinary story, and as you say, that Indigenous fire culture is something that we could learn a great deal from. The anniversary today, David Packham, of the Black Friday fires of 39, are we ever likely to see their like again?
Oh, yes. It's these conditions will turn up about every 30-odd years, and we will always get the ignitions. We'll always get the hot weather. We understand a lot more about that now than what we did. And until we get the fuels under control, and we're aiming to do 5% of the forest areas burnt each year. Now, that would be 20 years before we could even been over once. So we really have to, and there is wonderfully strong evidence about this, which one can talk about and produce, but there's not time for sure. And that is that you need to be somewhere around 10 to 15% of your area burnt with mild, frequent prescribed burns each year before you'll end up with a potential life loss of about 1/10 of what we had in the Black Saturday fires.
Fascinating area, David Packham. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
David Packham, he's a fire management consultant at CSIRO for 18 years. Talking there today, the 75th anniversary of those 1939 Black Friday fires that, as we were saying, burnt out 3/4 of Victoria at the cost of 71 lives. 16.5 after 8. Is there anything that we could do to cure the apparently endemic chronic issue of homelessness?
Okay, let's talk about bushfires. I've said it before and I'll say it again. People like me, serious greenies, are not permitted to burn in the way the Aborigines were, because the Aborigines would pretty much burn directly after rain whenever they could get away with it. At least that's what Bill Gammage said in that book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. So 2 days ago I had 5 millimetres. That means yesterday I should have been burning off. But I wasn't, because I would need to get a permit to burn, and I wouldn't be able to get a permit to burn because we're looking at my boundary fence, and I could not provide evidence of a 3-metre ploughed earth boundary to save the boundary fence from any fire that I might like to ignite. Also, about 1 kilometre, maybe 1.2 kilometres to the east of me, there's a highway, and I'm not permitted to put any smoke across the highway. So I'm reduced to slash and burn, well, slash instead of burn. I use a field slasher and I try and sheet mulch, but I can't do the whole 100 acres. I went for a walk the other day, and once you get beyond the little perimeter that I've been slashing, this place is in fact a fuel bomb. There's a fantasy that Australia can burn 5% of its forests, which, as the fella on the radio just explained, that's that's a third of what we should be doing. But the fantasy is we can hazard reduction burn 5% with volunteer labour on the weekends during winter. And it's just not happening. You have to follow the rain around. When it rains and the country is too wet to catch fire into a huge convection runaway, that's when you put your low intensity fire through somewhere that hasn't been burnt for a while. But we're not allowed to do that. If I was to start lighting fires here because it needs to be burnt, I would get prosecuted, because nobody downwind wants to take the risk that I may lose control of the fire. And I must admit, if somebody upwind of me was to light a fire, I would shit blue lights too, because the country's already a fuel bomb. They've apparently lost 20 or 30 houses in the hills around Perth last night. They've just had a week of 40-degree temperatures, and that wave of 40-degree temperatures is sweeping across South Australia and Victoria and Western New South Wales, and I'm bloody hoping that it does not come here. That's all I can do. Hope it doesn't come here. And for the global warming denialists, the people who really don't want to accept the fact that humanity has kind of screwed the pooch, you'll learn. You'll learn. It'll all catch up with you in the fullness of the time. I wonder how VB Ed's going over there in Perth with his theory that the capitalist laissez-faire, deregulated, fuck the environment system has always been good to him. I wonder how he's feeling about that now. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Here we go. How can we have a movie talking about the Australian forest without getting the endorsement of some of the critters who live in it? Hey, isn't that right, mate? Yes. boy, aren't you? Okay. This time I mean it. Ciao.